before the first cry of alarm echoed across rural Virginia, before history gave this moment a name, there was a quiet tension woven into everyday life. Fields stretched toward the horizon. Churches rang their bells on Sundays. And beneath this surface calm lay a system built on fear, control, and forced silence. This is where our story begins. Southampton County, Virginia, 1831. Imagine a world where freedom is discussed only in whispers, where movement is watched, learning is restricted, and faith becomes both refuge and rebellion. In the antebellum South, chattel slavery was not only an economic system, it was a total order enforced by laws, patrols, and constant surveillance. Every aspect of life was designed to maintain power and suppress hope. Yet history shows that even the most rigid systems carry the seeds of resistance. At the center of this story stands Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher shaped by scripture, visions, and a deep belief that injustice could not last forever. In a society that denied enslaved people literacy and voice, Turner's faith gave him language, purpose, and conviction. His rebellion did not emerge from chaos, it grew from years of oppression. Spiritual reflection, and the unfulfilled promise of human dignity. What followed would shock the nation, harden laws across the South, and deepen the divide between those who defended slavery and those who sought its end. Nat Turner's rebellion forced America to confront a question it could no longer ignore. What happens when a system built on domination meets people who refuse to accept it? In this video, we will explore the origins, meaning, and lasting impact of Nat Turner's rebellion, placing it within its historical context and examining why it still matters today. If you value thoughtful history, deeper understanding, and stories that shape the world we live in, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these important conversations alive. In the tense world of Southampton County, where fear quietly shaped every interaction and obedience was enforced by law, Nat Turner's inner life set him apart long before his name entered the historical record. He was known among both enslaved and enslavers as a man deeply immersed in Scripture, someone who spoke the language of the Bible with unusual confidence and clarity. In a society that sought to control not only bodies but also thoughts, Turner's religious knowledge gave him a rare form of authority, one that did not come from position or permission, but from belief. Turner did not see faith as comfort alone. For him, the Bible was not a text that justified suffering or demanded patience in the face of injustice. Instead, he read it as a living narrative of judgment, deliverance, and moral reckoning. Stories of prophets, plagues, and divine intervention resonated with his own experience of bondage, shaping a worldview in which oppression was not permanent but temporary, not natural but condemned. Slavery, in Turner's understanding, was not merely cruel. It was a profound moral violation that stood in direct opposition to divine order. Over time, this interpretation deepened into something more personal and more urgent. Turner believed that he had been marked for a purpose, guided by signs he interpreted through an apocalyptic lens. Natural events, shifts in the sky, and passages of Scripture blended into a single message. Judgment was approaching, and history was moving toward a moment of reckoning. These beliefs did not develop in isolation. They emerged within the same system of surveillance and control described earlier, where religious gatherings among enslaved people were closely watched, and any suggestion of independent thought was treated as a threat. What made Turner's faith especially powerful was its ability to transform private suffering into collective meaning. In secret conversations and shared moments of worship, his interpretations offered a language that named injustice and promised its end. He did not speak of freedom as an abstract hope deferred to the distant future, but as a moral certainty rooted in divine law. This message resonated in a world where legal systems denied humanity and violence enforced compliance. Faith became, for Turner and those who listened, a way to reclaim dignity in a society designed to strip it away. This spiritual framework also connected directly to the broader atmosphere of the antebellum South. The same laws that restricted movement and education feared religious independence for a reason. Belief could inspire action. Turner's readings challenged the narratives promoted by slaveholders, who often used selective scripture to demand obedience and submission. By reinterpreting these texts, Turner reversed their meaning, turning instruments of control into sources of condemnation against the system itself. Seen in this light, Nat Turner's rebellion did not arise from sudden anger or chaos. It was the outcome of a long internal journey shaped by faith, oppression, and a sense of historical purpose. His conviction that slavery was destined for judgment reflected a deeper truth about the society he lived in. Beneath the appearance of order lay a constant anxiety that the moral contradictions of slavery would one day be exposed. Turner gave form to that fear, embodying the possibility that belief, when fused with lived experience, could challenge even the most rigid structures of power. By placing Turner's visions within the larger context of surveillance, violence, and enforced silence, his story becomes more than an individual biography. It reveals how ideas take root under pressure, how faith can become a lens through which injustice is understood, and how moral certainty can grow in the shadows of repression. This continuity from the quiet tension of Southampton County to Turner's belief in judgment binds the story together, showing how a system built to suppress voices inadvertently shaped one that history could not ignore. In a landscape shaped by constant surveillance and quiet fear, secrecy was not a strategy of choice but a condition of survival. Following the spiritual awakening that gave Nat Turner his sense of purpose, the path toward action unfolded slowly and deliberately, woven into the ordinary rhythms of plantation life. Nothing could be rushed. Every word, every gesture, every moment of trust carried consequences. The system that governed Southampton County was designed to detect and crush any sign of collective resistance, which meant that preparation had to remain invisible, hidden within spaces that already existed. Religious gatherings became one such space. Prayer meetings, tolerated because they were seen as tools of obedience, offered rare moments where enslaved people could speak with a degree of privacy. Within these gatherings, language took on layered meaning. Scripture was discussed openly, but its interpretations carried messages that went beyond the surface. Stories of deliverance, trials, and divine judgment allowed ideas to circulate without drawing attention, transforming faith into a shared code understood only by those who listened closely. In this environment, belief and planning quietly intertwined. Trust formed the backbone of the network that emerged. Turner did not speak broadly or recklessly. He relied on a small circle of individuals bound by long relationships, shared labor, and common suffering. In a world where betrayal could mean death or lifelong punishment, trust was earned through time and consistency, not persuasion. Conversations unfolded gradually, often in isolated moments after work or during travel between plantations, where the presence of overseers was less constant and the land itself offered brief cover from watchful eyes. Communication, too, adapted to the pressures of surveillance. Plans were never written down, never spoken plainly, and never discussed in large groups. Messages traveled through hints, pauses, and familiar references that would appear harmless to an outside listener. Timing was marked by natural cycles, harvests, seasons, and religious observances rather than fixed dates. This approach reduced risk while reinforcing a sense of shared understanding, turning daily life into both a disguise and a tool. The months of preparation reflected the same patience and conviction that defined Turner's religious worldview. Just as he believed history moved according to a divine timetable, he treated organization as a process that required waiting for the right moment. This restraint was critical. Any sign of urgency or disorder would have drawn attention in a county already alert to the possibility of unrest. By blending preparation into routine, The emerging plan remained unseen, even as it took clearer shape in the minds of those involved. What is striking about this period is how it mirrored the broader contradictions of the society itself. The very systems designed to control enslaved people forced gatherings, shared labor, and restricted movement also created the conditions for connection. Networks formed not despite oppression, but within it. The rebellion's organization exposed a truth that slaveholding society struggled to admit. Control could never be total, and human agency persisted even under extreme constraint. By the time the moment approached, the groundwork had already been laid through months of quiet coordination. There were no public signals, no dramatic declarations, only a shared readiness built through trust, belief, and careful silence. This phase of the story reveals that Nat Turner's rebellion was not an impulsive act, but a carefully prepared response shaped by the same forces that defined life in Southampton County. It connected faith to action, secrecy to survival, and individual conviction to collective resolve, setting the stage for events that would soon force the nation to confront the realities it tried so hard to conceal. When the long period of waiting finally gave way to action in August 1831, the shift was sudden but not chaotic. The secrecy, trust, and shared belief that had taken months to build now moved from thought into motion, unfolding across the familiar roads and farms of Southampton County. What followed was not random destruction, but a series of deliberate acts aimed at the heart of a system that had defined power, ownership, and hierarchy for generations. Turner and those who joined him moved through spaces they knew well, confronting households that represented the daily reality of bondage and control. The choice of targets reflected the meaning Turner had long attached to slavery itself. Slaveholding families were not seen merely as individuals, but as symbols of a structure that shaped every aspect of life in the county. Plantations were places where labor was extracted, movement restricted, and punishment normalized. By striking these households, the rebellion challenged the assumption that this order was permanent and untouchable. The actions carried a message as much as they carried consequence. The system could be confronted, even if only briefly. As news spread, fear traveled faster than the rebellion itself. The same quiet countryside that had masked months of preparation now amplified uncertainty and confusion. Roads once associated with trade and routine became channels of alarm, as word moved from farm to farm that something unprecedented was unfolding. For white residents, the rebellion shattered the illusion of complete control, revealing how fragile the social order truly was beneath its surface calm. For the enslaved population, it exposed both the possibility of resistance and the heavy risks that came with it. It is important to understand this moment within the context already established: the constant surveillance, the restricted gatherings, and the belief-driven preparation that preceded it. Turner's actions did not emerge from impulse, nor were they detached from his religious worldview. He believed judgment was not only inevitable but imminent, and the rebellion became, in his, a physical manifestation of that belief. The line between spiritual conviction and historical action blurred, turning faith into a force that directly confronted lived reality. The scale of the uprising was limited in time and space, but its impact was immediate and far-reaching. Approximately 55 to 60 white residents lost their lives, a number that would echo loudly in newspapers, courtrooms, and political debates across the nation. This was not because of its size alone, but because of what it represented. The rebellion struck at the deepest anxieties of a slaveholding society. The fear that those it sought to dominate could organize, decide, and act for themselves. As the rebellion progressed, its meaning shifted in the public imagination. To some, it became proof of danger and disorder. To others, evidence of the moral contradictions at the core of slavery. These competing interpretations would soon shape the response that followed. Influencing laws, policies, and public discourse. In this way, The events of August 1831 extended far beyond Southampton County, becoming part of a national reckoning over power, fear, and human dignity. This phase of the story marks a turning point where belief, preparation, and action converged. It connected the quiet tension of everyday life under slavery to an explosive challenge against it, revealing how deeply the system depended on the suppression of resistance. The rebellion did not dismantle slavery, but it forced the nation to confront the cost of maintaining it, ensuring that the questions raised in those days could not be easily silenced or forgotten. The response to the rebellion was swift and overwhelming, shaped by fear as much as by force. Once the scale of the uprising became clear, local authorities moved quickly to reassert control, calling in state militias and, soon after, federal troops. The countryside that had only days earlier seemed quiet and orderly filled with armed patrols, checkpoints, and urgent commands. Roads were watched, homes searched, and any movement by black residents was treated with suspicion. The goal was not only to stop the rebellion, but to restore the sense of dominance that had been so abruptly shaken. Within this tightening net, Nat Turner disappeared. While the organized resistance had been crushed, Turner himself avoided capture for weeks, hiding in the woods and fields of the county he knew intimately. This period of concealment added another layer to the story, transforming him from a rebel leader into a figure of near-mythic anxiety for local authorities. His continued freedom, however brief, kept alive the fear that the rebellion's spirit had not yet been fully extinguished. Each passing day without his capture deepened the sense that control, once broken, could not be instantly repaired. The search for Turner became relentless. Patrols combed the countryside, driven by both official orders and widespread panic. Rumors spread easily, and suspicion often replaced evidence. In this atmosphere, the distinction between restoring order and asserting power blurred. The same systems of surveillance that had defined life before the rebellion were intensified, now justified by the claim of public safety. Fear shaped decisions, and fear accelerated action. When Turner was finally captured, the moment marked the symbolic end of the rebellion's active phase. His arrest was treated not merely as the detention of an individual, but as a necessary conclusion to a crisis that had unsettled the entire region. The legal process that followed moved quickly. Turner was brought to trial, questioned about his motives, and asked to explain the beliefs that had guided his actions. His words, recorded and circulated, would later shape how the rebellion was remembered, debated, and interpreted. The trial itself reflected the imbalance of power that had defined the society from the beginning. The outcome was never in doubt. Turner was convicted and sentenced to death, and his execution was intended to serve as a public demonstration that resistance would be met with absolute authority. For those in power, it was a warning meant to restore confidence and deter future uprisings. For others, it marked the silencing of a voice that had dared to challenge the moral foundations of slavery. Yet even as the state asserted its dominance, the deeper consequences of the rebellion could not be undone. Turner's weeks in hiding, his trial, and his execution did not erase the questions his actions had raised. Instead, they intensified them. The rapid mobilization of militias and federal troops revealed how fragile the existing order truly was, dependent on constant enforcement and ready violence to sustain itself. The need for such a forceful response underscored the fear that slavery inspired among those who defended it. This phase of the story brings the earlier themes into sharp focus. The secrecy, belief, and preparation that led to the uprising were met by surveillance, punishment, and state power. Faith-driven conviction encountered institutional authority, and the result was not resolution but escalation. Turner's death closed one chapter, but it did not close the debate. His rebellion, though suppressed, left a lasting imprint on the nation's conscience. Shaping laws, attitudes, and anxieties in ways that would endure long after the militias had withdrawn and the fields of Southampton County returned to uneasy quiet. When the rebellion had been forcibly ended and its leaders removed from view, the violence did not stop with the restoration of official control. Instead, a darker and more indiscriminate phase followed, driven not by strategy but by fear. Across Southampton County and neighboring areas, anxiety hardened into suspicion, and suspicion quickly turned into collective punishment. The rebellion had exposed how fragile the existing order was, and many white residents responded by attempting to erase that vulnerability through overwhelming force. Mobs formed in the days and weeks after the uprising, fueled by rumors and a belief that danger still lurked everywhere. The distinction between participation and innocence collapsed under the weight of panic. Black people, regardless of their connection to the rebellion, were treated as potential threats simply because of who they were. In this climate, fear replaced evidence, and restraint gave way to retaliation. The goal was no longer to stop a rebellion, but to reassert dominance through terror. This response was deeply connected to the systems already described throughout the story. The same society that relied on surveillance and control before the rebellion now intensified those instincts beyond legal boundaries. Patrols were no longer just organized forces acting under state authority. They were joined by civilians who believed violence itself was a form of security. The line between justice and vengeance disappeared, revealing how quickly order could unravel into chaos when power felt endangered. For enslaved and free black communities alike, the aftermath became a period of profound uncertainty. Everyday activities, traveling, gathering, even speaking carried new risks. The atmosphere of fear that had long existed under slavery now became openly brutal, reinforcing the message that resistance, or even perceived association with it, would bring severe consequences. Many who had played no role in the rebellion suffered simply because the system demanded a display of absolute control. This wave of retaliatory violence served a symbolic purpose for those enforcing it. It was meant to send a clear signal that the rebellion had not only failed, but would be answered with consequences far beyond its original scope. In doing, it revealed one of the central contradictions of slavery. A system that claimed stability depended on constant acts of instability to survive. The need for such widespread punishment exposed how deeply fear shaped the social order. The national impact of these events extended well beyond Virginia. Reports of mob violence and mass reprisals circulated widely, hardening attitudes and deepening divisions. For defenders of slavery, the violence was often framed as a necessary response to restore safety. For critics, it stood as further evidence of slavery's moral collapse, showing how easily it produced cruelty not as an exception, but as a pattern. The rebellion and its aftermath became inseparable in public memory, each reinforcing the meaning of the other. In this way, the aftermath completed the cycle begun long before the rebellion itself. Oppression produced resistance, resistance produced panic, and panic produced even harsher oppression. The violence against uninvolved black people was not an accident of history, but a reflection of a system that viewed entire communities through the lens of control and fear. While the militias withdrew and official proceedings concluded, the scars left by this period endured, shaping laws, attitudes, and lived experiences for years to come. This chapter of the story underscores a central truth. The suppression of Nat Turner's rebellion did not restore moral order, only enforce silence. The collective punishment that followed revealed how far the society was willing to go to protect slavery, and how deeply it feared the possibility of change. In confronting that fear with violence, it ensured that the rebellion's meaning would not fade, but instead remain a powerful reminder of the human cost of a system built on domination. After the violence subsided and the immediate panic faded, the response of Southern authorities moved from the streets into the law books. The rebellion had revealed what those in power feared most: that belief communication, and shared knowledge could challenge even the most tightly controlled system. In answer, Southern states reshaped their slave codes, not as temporary measures, but as long-term defenses designed to prevent anything like Nat Turner's rebellion from happening again. Control would no longer rely only on patrols and punishment. It would be written more deeply into daily life. Literacy became one of the first targets. The ability to read and write was no longer seen as a neutral skill, but as a potential threat. Turner's use of scripture, his interpretations, and his authority as a preacher had shown how knowledge could empower thought and coordination. New laws sharply restricted black education, aiming to sever access to ideas before they could take shape. Words themselves were treated as dangerous, capable of inspiring reflection, resistance, and shared purpose. By limiting literacy, lawmakers hoped to limit imagination. Religious gatherings were also tightly constrained. Earlier, faith had existed in an uneasy balance, tolerated when it appeared to reinforce obedience and closely watched when it did not. After the rebellion, that balance collapsed. Independent worship among black communities was increasingly restricted or placed under white supervision. The same prayer meetings that had once offered spiritual refuge were now viewed as spaces of potential organization. Authorities understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that belief could unite people in ways that force alone could not easily break. Movement, too, came under heavier regulation. Travel between plantations, already monitored, became more restricted. With passes, curfews, and patrols used to limit contact across communities. These measures were meant to isolate, to prevent networks of trust from forming, and to keep people confined not just physically but socially. By narrowing the spaces where interaction could occur, the system sought to dismantle the quiet connections that had made coordinated action possible. These harsher codes reflected a deeper shift in Southern society. The rebellion had shattered the illusion that slavery was stable and uncontested. Lawmakers responded not by questioning the system, but by tightening it, attempting to seal every opening that fear had revealed. In doing, they exposed the central paradox of slavery. The more it relied on repression, the more it acknowledged its own vulnerability. Each new restriction was an admission that control was never complete. The impact of these laws reached far beyond Southampton County. Across the South, black communities experienced a narrowing of daily life, where ordinary acts learning, worshipping, visiting family became subject to suspicion and punishment. The fear that followed the rebellion was transformed into policy, embedding anxiety into legal structures that would shape generations. These measures did not erase resistance, but they did push it further into silence, forcing it to adapt rather than disappear. At the same time, these laws influenced the national conversation about slavery. To critics, the tightening of slave codes confirmed that slavery could not coexist with freedom of thought or faith. To defenders, the laws were presented as necessary protections, even as they contradicted claims of a humane system. In this way, the legal aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion deepened the moral divide already forming across the country. This chapter of the story brings together all that came before it. Turner's faith-driven conviction, the secrecy of organization, the eruption of violence, the panic of retaliation, and now the cold permanence of law all form a single arc. The harsher slave codes were not merely reactions to rebellion. They were attempts to control the future by reshaping everyday life. Yet in trying to prevent uprisings through restriction and fear, Southern states ensured that the questions raised in 1831 would continue to haunt the nation, unresolved and impossible to ignore. As the immediate violence faded and laws were rewritten, the deeper impact of Nat Turner's rebellion continued to spread far beyond Virginia. What had begun in the fields and back roads of Southampton County now echoed across the entire nation, forcing Americans to confront slavery not as an abstract debate, but as a living crisis. The rebellion shattered any remaining illusion that slavery was a stable or unquestioned institution. It exposed the reality that bondage was maintained not by consent, but by fear, force, and constant repression. For supporters of slavery, the rebellion hardened attitudes and radicalized defenses of the system. Instead of reflection, many responded with apatism, arguing that only tighter control, harsher laws, and uncompromising authority could preserve order. Slavery was increasingly framed as something that had to be protected at all costs, even as those costs grew more visible and more severe. This defensive posture revealed how deeply slavery depended on denial of humanity, denial of injustice, and denial of the consequences it produced. At the same time, Nat Turner's rebellion strengthened abolitionist resolve. For those who opposed slavery, the uprising became powerful evidence that bondage was not only morally wrong but fundamentally unsustainable. It demonstrated that resistance was not imposed from the outside, but born from within the enslaved population itself. Abolitionists pointed to the rebellion and its brutal aftermath as proof that slavery corrupted laws, encouraged violence, and demanded ever-increasing repression to survive. Turner's actions intensified the urgency of the anti-slavery movement, transforming moral arguments into warnings about the nation's future. Beyond politics and ideology, the rebellion took on a lasting symbolic meaning. Nat Turner became a figure through whom Americans wrestled with uncomfortable questions about justice, violence, faith, and resistance. To some, he represented terror. To others, a tragic but powerful expression of human refusal to accept perpetual bondage. His rebellion forced the country to acknowledge that slavery was not a passive condition endured quietly, but a system contested by those trapped within it, even at immense personal cost. This enduring symbolism is why Nat Turner's rebellion continues to be studied, debated, and remembered. It stands at the intersection of belief and action, oppression and resistance, fear and conviction. The rebellion did not end slavery, but it exposed its deepest contradictions and accelerated the divisions that would eventually tear the nation apart. In that, its legacy reaches forward into the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the ongoing struggle to confront the meaning of freedom and equality. As this story comes to a close, one truth remains clear: Nat Turner's rebellion was not an isolated moment of violence, but a turning point that forced America to look at itself without illusion. It reminds us that systems built on domination inevitably face resistance, and that history is shaped not only by laws and leaders, but by the choices of those who refuse to accept injustice as fate. Thank you for listening and for spending this time exploring history with us. If you found this story meaningful and want more thoughtful, in-depth historical narratives, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these important stories alive and shared.